The scene opens not in a lab but in a quiet English countryside. The year is 1666. London is in the grips of the Great Plague, a terrifying disease that has forced a mass exodus from the cities. Among those fleeing is a young, intense student from Cambridge University. His name is Isaac Newton. He has returned to his family's home, the manor house of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire. It is here, in this unexpected period of isolation, that the world is about to change. One afternoon, as the story is so often told, Newton is sitting in the garden deep in thought. Perhaps he is drinking tea. His eyes catch the sight of an apple falling from a tree, plummeting straight down to the ground. This mundane event, witnessed by countless people before him, sparks a question in his mind of extraordinary depth. Why did that apple fall perpendicularly, straight down towards the earth? Why did it not go sideways or upwards? What force draws every object invariably towards the earth's center? He began to speculate that this force must not be limited to a certain distance from the earth, but must extend much further than was usually thought. Why not as high as the moon, he wondered, and if so, that force must influence the moon's motion, keeping it in its orbit around the earth. This chain of thought, starting with a falling apple, would eventually lead him to formulate the theory of universal gravitation. But this was just one of the miracles of what historians would later call his annus mirabilis, his year of wonders. To understand the man who would have these thoughts, we must go back to the beginning. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day 1642, in that very same Woolsthorpe manor. He was a small, sickly baby, so frail that his mother Hannah reportedly said he could have fit inside a quart mug. His father, also named Isaac Newton, a prosperous but uneducated farmer, had died 3 months before his son's birth. The infant Isaac's survival was his first great defiance of the odds. His childhood was lonely and shaped by a sense of abandonment. When he was 3 years old, his mother remarried a wealthy clergyman named Barnabas Smith and went to live with him in a nearby village. She left her young son behind to be raised by his elderly grandparents. Newton would later confess in his journals to feeling a deep and lasting bitterness toward his stepfather and a sense of betrayal by his mother. This early isolation forged a solitary, introspective, and fiercely independent character. He learned to rely on his own mind for company. He was sent to the King's School in Grantham, where he lodged with a local apothecary. It was here that his incredible intellectual abilities first began to show. He was a top student, though initially more noted for his meticulous building of moshing, sundials, and kites than for a particular academic brilliance. However, a cousin who recognized his potential convinced his mother to let him continue his education instead of forcing him to become a farmer, a fate the bookish Newton would have been utterly unsuited for. In 1661, he was admitted to Trinity College, Cambridge, but his time at Cambridge was not typical. He was a sizer, a poor student who performed menial tasks for the wealthier students to pay his way. This further reinforced his social isolation. More importantly, he was deeply unimpressed by the standard university curriculum, which was still based heavily on the ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle. Instead, Newton embarked on a path of self-education. He devoured the works of the modern scientific thinkers of his age, Galileo, Descartes, and the pioneering chemist Robert Boyle. He filled a notebook he titled Questiones Quaedam Philosophici, certain philosophical questions, with his own ideas, experiments, and challenges to established knowledge. By the time the plague forced him to leave Cambridge in 1665, his mind was a powder keg of revolutionary ideas, and the solitude of Woolsthorpe provided the spark. The plague years of 1665 and 1666 were his miracle time. Freed from all academic obligations and distractions, he could think with a depth and intensity few humans have ever matched. His work during this period can be broken into 3 monumental categories. First, in mathematics, he invented what he called the method of fluxions. This was a radically new form of mathematics that could calculate the rate of change of things in motion, the speed of a falling apple, the curve of a planet's orbit. We know it today as calculus. It was a tool that would become indispensable to modern science and engineering. Second, in optics, he began experimenting with prisms. He turned his room into a camera obscura, letting a single beam of sunlight through a small hole. He then placed a prism in its path, and instead of just creating a pretty splash of color on the wall, he conducted a precise experiment. He saw that the light stretched out into an oblong spectrum of colors. He then used a second prism to try to recombine the colors back into white light. Through these experiments, he conclusively demonstrated that white light is not pure and homogeneous, as had been believed since Aristotle, but is actually a mixture of all the colors of the rainbow. This was the birth of modern optics, and third, of course, was his work on motion and gravity. The falling apple was the catalyst for a series of profound thoughts about the nature of force. He began to formulate his 3 laws of motion: that an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon by a force, that force is equal to mass times acceleration, and that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. He then deduced that the force that makes an apple fall is the very same force that holds the moon in its orbit around the Earth, and the Earth in its orbit around the sun. He had discovered universal gravitation, the invisible string that ties the cosmos together. Yet in a testament to his secretive and perfectionist nature, Newton told almost no one about these discoveries. He placed his papers in a drawer and returned to Cambridge in 1667 when the plague subsided. He was elected a Fellow of Trinity College, and just 2 years later, at the age of 26, he was appointed the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. For the next 15 years, he refined his ideas, taught his largely unattended lectures, and delved deeply into another passion: alchemy. He spent countless hours in a laboratory, surrounded by furnaces and chemicals, searching for the secrets of matter and the philosopher's stone. This was not a contradiction to his scientific work. To Newton, it was all part of the same quest to understand the hidden laws of God's universe. The world might never have learned of his genius were it not for the astronomer Edmund Halley. In 1684, Halley visited Newton in Cambridge and asked him a simple question: what path would a planet take if it were attracted to the sun by a force inversely proportional to the square of its distance? Newton immediately replied, an ellipse. He had calculated it years before. Halley was astounded and urged him to publish his findings. Newton embarked on an 18-month period of intense, concentrated effort. The result was arguably the most important scientific book ever written, Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, published in 1687. In it, he laid out his 3 laws of motion and his law of universal gravitation with mathematical rigor. For the first time, he provided a single unified system of laws that could explain everything from the tides in the oceans to the paths of comets in the sky. It was a work of unparalleled genius that completely reshaped science. The publication of the Principia marked the peak of his purely academic life. The glorious revolution of 1688 saw him become a member of Parliament for Cambridge University, though he was a silent one. In 1696, he moved to London to take up the post of warden, and later Master of the Royal Mint. He took this job with immense seriousness, applying his formidable intellect to reforming England's currency and fiercely prosecuting counterfeiters. In 1703, he was elected President of the Royal Society, the premier scientific organization in England, a position he held until his death. He now reigned as the titan of European science. In 1704, he published his second great work, Optics, which detailed his decades of experiments with light and color. A year later, he was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac Newton. The latter part of his life was also marked by famous and bitter disputes, most notably with the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, over who had first invented calculus. Newton used his position as president of the Royal Society to ensure the outcome of the official inquiry favored him, tarnishing his reputation with a display of ruthless pride. Sir Isaac Newton died in 1727 at the age of 84. He was given a state funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey, a fitting tribute to a man who had become a national treasure. He was a paradox, a difficult, secretive, and often vengeful man, but one who possessed one of the most astonishing intellects in human history. He was the colossus of the scientific revolution, a man who peered into the very mechanisms of the universe and, for the first time, explained them not with mystery, but with mathematics. From a falling apple to the motion of the heavens, he gave us the laws that govern our world.